The air was heavy with the scent of burning wood and shattered memories. The sound of glass crunching underfoot echoed like a haunting melody as Marcus stood before the ruins of his home. What was once a symbol of years of hard work, sacrifice, and perseverance was now a charred skeleton of its former self. His pulse throbbed in his ears, but his face remained calm, a mask honed by years of discipline. Marcus Graham, a quiet man in his late 40s, had never been one to seek trouble. He valued peace, respected his neighbors, and lived a life defined by humility. A black man in a predominantly white town, he knew what it meant to navigate prejudice with grace. For years, he thought he had earned his place here. His kind gestures and unshakable calm had disarmed many who might otherwise judge him. Also, he believed, but last night changed everything. The gang came under the cover of darkness, emboldened by hate and ignorance. They smashed windows, spray-painted slurs across the walls, and lit fires that consumed everything Marcus held dear. They shouted vile words, their laughter ringing out into the night as the flames roared higher. By the time the fire department arrived, it was too late. The house was gone. Standing there now, Marcus's neighbors whispered in hushed tones, their eyes darting between the smoldering ruins and the man who had lost everything. They murmured about the gang, about how bold they had been, and about the eerie calm that Marcus exuded despite the devastation before him. But Marcus wasn't just calm. He was calculating. The gang didn't know the man they had targeted. To them, he was just another outsider, a face they didn't like, a life they thought they could destroy without consequences. What they didn't realize was that Marcus Graham wasn't just a man who knew how to keep his head down. He was a man who had spent decades mastering the art of survival. For 20 years, Marcus had served as a Navy SEAL, part of an elite group trained to operate in the most dangerous and high-stakes environments on Earth. He had carried out missions no one could ever know about, saved lives, and ended threats before they even realized he was there. His calm demeanor wasn't weakness. It was the quiet confidence of a man who knew exactly what he was capable of. As Marcus stood before the remnants of his home, he could feel the weight of his neighbors' eyes on him. He offered no explanation, no glimpse into the storm brewing inside. Instead, he turned and walked away, his steps steady, his purpose clear. The gang thought they had destroyed him, but they had no idea what they had unleashed. Somewhere in the shadows of the town, the gang celebrated their so-called victory. They had no reason to believe they were in danger. They didn't know Marcus' past. They didn't know the lengths to which he would go to protect what was his. And they certainly didn't know what kind of man they had just made their enemy. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars began to pierce the sky, Marcus sat in his truck, the engine idling. His fingers traced the dog tags hanging from the rearview mirror, a silent reminder of the life he had once lived and the skills he had tried to leave behind. He had hoped for a quiet retirement, a chance to live peacefully in a world that often felt anything but. Now that dream was ashes, just like his home. Marcus knew one thing for certain: this wasn't over. The gang might have started this, but he would finish it. For years, he had protected strangers from danger. This time, the fight was personal. The quiet town that had watched Marcus live as a neighbor was about to see a side of him they never imagined. The gang thought they had won. They didn't realize they had just made the most dangerous mistake of their lives. As Marcus shifted the truck into gear and drove off into the night, a cold determination set in. He had spent his life serving and protecting. Now it was time to remind the world and the gang that some lines should never be crossed. And in the stillness of the dark, with nothing but the hum of the engine for company, Marcus's lips curved into a faint, unyielding smile. As Marcus drove through the quiet streets, the hum of the engine steady beneath him, his mind drifted back to the life he thought he'd left behind. For 2 decades, he had operated in the shadows, a ghost whose existence was only whispered about in hushed tones among enemies of the nation. He had traveled to places most people couldn't find on a map, completed missions so dangerous that failure was never an option, and witnessed horrors that most could never imagine. And yet, none of it had hardened his heart. What kept him grounded were the memories of home, the promise of peace, the hope of one day living a life far removed from the violence and chaos. That was why he had chosen this small town, far from the noise of the cities and the ghosts of his past. It wasn't perfect, he knew that from the beginning. But Marcus wasn't naive. He had dealt with prejudice before, learned to navigate it with quiet strength. He thought he had found a place where he could live peacefully, where his presence might eventually disarm even the most reluctant neighbors. For years, he thought he had succeeded. Until now. The gang's attack wasn't just an act of hatred, it was a message. They wanted him gone, out of their town, out of their sight. But Marcus wasn't the kind of man to run. He had faced enemies far more dangerous than these young men filled with ignorance and malice. They didn't intimidate him. They didn't scare him. If anything, they had awakened something within him, a resolve he hadn't felt in years. As he passed the diner on the corner, a familiar face caught his eye. Mrs. Jenkins, an older woman with kind eyes, stood by the window, watching him with concern. She had always been one of the few people in town who treated him with genuine warmth. He nodded to her as he drove by, her worried expression lingering in his mind. She had once told him, "Marcus, you're a good man. Don't let this town make you think otherwise." Those words echoed now, a quiet reassurance that not everyone here harbored the same hate. But the reality was clear. The town was divided. Some whispered their support for Marcus in private, while others remained silent, unwilling to risk the wrath of the gang. And then there were those who openly celebrated the destruction of his home, their faces smug with satisfaction. Marcus knew these dynamics all too well. He had seen them in war zones, communities torn apart by fear and power. The only difference was the battlefield. By the time he reached the outskirts of town, the night had settled in, a blanket of darkness stretching over the empty roads. Marcus pulled off onto a dirt path, his truck bouncing gently over the uneven terrain. He stopped at a clearing surrounded by trees, a place he had discovered during his early days in the town. It was quiet here, isolated, the perfect spot to think. He stepped out of the truck and leaned against the hood, the cool night air brushing against his face. Above him, the stars glittered in an endless expanse, a stark contrast to the turmoil brewing below. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small notebook, its edges worn from years of use. Flipping it open, he scanned the pages, each one filled with names, locations, and fragments of memories from his time in the Navy SEALs. It was a habit he had never given up, documenting details, piecing together information like a puzzle. Tonight, he started a new entry. He scribbled down descriptions of the gang members, their faces etched into his memory from that night. He noted the symbols they had spray-painted on his house, the slurs they had shouted. Every detail mattered, no matter how small. It was how he operated, methodical, precise, always thinking 3 steps ahead. Marcus didn't just want justice. He wanted understanding. He needed to know who these young men were, why they had chosen him as their target, and what fueled their hatred. Was it just ignorance, or was there something deeper at play? He had learned long ago that people often acted out of fear, and fear could be exploited, manipulated. But as much as Marcus wanted answers, he also knew he couldn't wait for them to come to him. The gang had made their move, and now it was his turn. He wouldn't retaliate with violence, not unless it was absolutely necessary. Instead, he would use the skills he had spent a lifetime honing: observation, strategy, patience. The gang had left clues, even if they didn't realize it. The paint they used, the way they spoke, the vehicles they drove, all of it told a story. And Marcus was an expert at reading between the lines. As he closed the notebook and slipped it back into his pocket, a noise in the distance caught his attention. A rustling in the trees, faint but distinct. Marcus' muscles tensed, his instincts kicking in. He stayed perfectly still, his ears straining to pick up any additional sounds. There it was again. He turned slowly, his eyes scanning the tree line. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then a figure emerged from the shadows, a young man, no older than 20, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "Mr. Graham," the boy said, his voice shaky. Marcus didn't respond immediately. He studied the boy, noting the nervous twitch of his fingers, the way his eyes darted around, as if expecting someone to jump out from the darkness. "I'm not here to cause trouble," the boy continued, his voice barely above a whisper. I wanted to talk to you about what happened." Marcus remained silent, his expression unreadable. He could tell the boy wasn't part of the gang. His posture was too uncertain, his demeanor too apologetic. Still, Marcus wasn't one to let his guard down easily. "Why are you here?" Marcus finally asked, his tone even. The boy swallowed hard, shifting on his feet. "I heard what happened, and I know some of the guys who did it. I don't agree with them. I think what they did was wrong. And I thought you should know." Marcus raised an eyebrow, intrigued but cautious. "And why should I trust you?" The boy hesitated, his gaze dropping to the ground. "Because I don't want to be like them. I don't want to be part of that hate. I want to make things right." For the first time that night, Marcus allowed a hint of emotion to show, a flicker of hope tempered by years of experience. He nodded slowly, gesturing for the boy to come closer. "All right," Marcus said, his voice firm, but not unkind. "Start talking." The boy took a deep breath, stepping into the clearing. And as he began to speak, Marcus listened intently, piecing together the first threads of a web that was far more tangled than he had imagined. The boy's voice quivered as he started to explain. His name was Ethan, and he wasn't just some bystander who knew the gang. He had been pulled into their orbit for a time, tempted by the camaraderie they offered and the way they made him feel invincible. But something about their actions had never sat right with him. Deep down, Ethan wasn't like them. He wasn't filled with the same hatred, the same thirst to tear others down. He had stayed quiet for too long, and now, seeing the destruction of Marcus's home had been the final straw. "I didn't know they were going to do that," Ethan said, his words rushing out as if he had been holding them in for weeks. "They talk big, about wanting to make a statement, but I didn't think they'd actually go through with it. I thought it was just talk." Marcus studied Ethan, his eyes narrowing slightly. He had encountered people like Ethan before, young, impressionable, unsure of where they stood in the world. They were easy targets for manipulation, especially by groups like the gang. But Marcus also knew that Ethan wasn't just here out of guilt. There was more to his story, and Marcus was determined to find out what it was. "Who are they?" Marcus asked, his voice calm but commanding. "I want names." Ethan hesitated, glancing nervously over his shoulder, as if expecting someone to emerge from the shadows. "I don't know all of them," he admitted. "But the main guys, they're led by a guy named Darryl. He's the one who came up with the plan to target you. Said he wanted to send a message." "Darryl," Marcus repeated, committing the name to memory. "What's his last name?" Ethan swallowed hard. "I don't know. He doesn't talk about his family or anything. But he's bad news, Mr. Graham. Real bad news. He's got people scared of him, even the ones who hang around him." Marcus nodded slowly, processing the information. He could see the fear in Ethan's eyes, the way his shoulders hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. Ethan wasn't just scared of the gang. He was scared of what might happen to him for coming forward. "Why are you really here, Ethan?" Marcus asked, his tone softer now. "You didn't come all this way just to tell me this. What do you want?" Ethan looked down at the ground, kicking at a patch of dirt with the toe of his sneaker. I guess I want to do the right thing," he said quietly. "But I don't know how. If they'd find out I talked to you," he trailed off, shaking his head. "I don't want to end up like you. I don't want them coming after me." Marcus leaned against the truck, folding his arms across his chest. He could see the conflict in Ethan, the way he wrestled with fear and regret. It reminded him of young recruits he had trained over the years, raw, unsure, but with potential waiting to be shaped. "You're scared," Marcus said, his voice steady. "That's normal. Fear is not a bad thing, Ethan. It's what you do with it that matters." Ethan looked up, his expression uncertain. "What can I do? I'm just one guy. They won't listen to me." Maybe not, Marcus replied, but you can help me, if you're willing. Ethan's eyes widened slightly. What do you mean? Marcus's gaze hardened, a flicker of determination sparking in his eyes. I need to know everything about them. Where they hang out, what they're planning, who they've hurt before. If you want to do the right thing, this is your chance. Ethan hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He glanced back toward the tree line, as if the shadows held the answers he sought. Finally, he nodded. Okay, I'll help you. But you have to promise you won't let them hurt me. Marcus' expression softened slightly, a rare glimpse of reassurance breaking through his steely exterior. I promise. As Ethan began to recount what he knew, Marcus listened intently, piecing together the puzzle. The gang wasn't just a group of angry young men. They were organized, strategic in their targeting, and growing bolder with each act of aggression. They had a network of sympathizers in the town, people who turned a blind eye or even quietly encouraged their actions. Darrell, their leader, was the mastermind, a man with a chip on his shoulder and a thirst for power. But it wasn't just the gang that concerned Marcus. There were other forces at play, subtle but unmistakable. Whispers of corruption in the local government, police officers who looked the other way, and business owners who supported the gang's agenda under the guise of protecting the traditions of the town. The more Marcus learned, the more he realized how deep the problem ran. This wasn't just about him. It was about a community poisoned by fear and prejudice. As the hours passed and the night grew colder, Marcus and Ethan sat by the truck, the boy's initial nervousness giving way to a cautious sense of trust. Marcus shared little about himself, but he didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to inspire a quiet confidence in Ethan, a belief that maybe, just maybe, things could change. By the time Ethan left, the first hints of dawn were beginning to creep over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Marcus watched him disappear down the dirt path, his silhouette growing smaller until it vanished completely. He felt a strange mix of emotions, hope, determination, and a simmering anger that refused to be ignored. As the sun rose over the town, casting long shadows across the empty streets, Marcus climbed back into his truck. He had a plan now, a strategy forming in his mind. The gang thought they were untouchable, that no one could challenge them. But they didn't know who they were dealing with. This wasn't just about rebuilding his home or clearing his name. This was about taking a stand, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been silenced, marginalized, or made to feel unwelcome. Marcus had spent his life fighting battles in far-off lands. Now the fight had come to his doorstep, and he was ready. As he drove back toward town, the resolve in his chest solidified. The gang had made their move. Now it was his turn, and he wasn't going to stop until the balance of power shifted and justice was served. The town woke up to a tense quiet that morning, as if the air itself held its breath. Marcus parked his truck a few blocks from his ruined home, wanting to avoid drawing attention. He had learned long ago that stealth was often his best ally. Walking the rest of the way, he noticed how the people on the street avoided meeting his eyes. Some offered quick nods, murmurs of condolences, while others crossed to the opposite sidewalk, their gazes fixed firmly ahead. The silence was louder than words, a reminder of how divided this place had become. As he neared his property, the acrid smell of burnt wood still lingered, a stubborn reminder of the night before. The charred remains of his house stood like a monument to the hatred that had fueled the attack. But Marcus wasn't thinking about what he had lost. His focus was on what came next. The information Ethan had given him replayed in his mind like a map he was slowly piecing together. The gang had a regular meeting spot, a derelict warehouse on the edge of town. It wasn't just a hideout, it was where they planned, schemed, and celebrated their victories. Ethan had also mentioned a name Marcus recognized from his quiet observations over the years. Darrell's second-in-command, a man named Wyatt. Wyatt was a local mechanic, someone with connections in every corner of the town. He was the one who helped the gang keep a low profile, smoothing over trouble and ensuring they stayed one step ahead of anyone who might challenge them. Marcus knew he couldn't walk into that warehouse unprepared. These weren't trained soldiers, but they were unpredictable, armed with the recklessness of people who believed they had nothing to lose. He spent the rest of the day gathering supplies, blending into the background as he moved from place to place. A trip to the hardware store for a few innocuous items. A stop at the sporting goods shop for something as simple as a flashlight. Each item seemed ordinary on its own, but in Marcus's hands, they became part of a larger strategy. By nightfall, Marcus found himself parked a safe distance from the warehouse. The building loomed in the darkness, its broken windows glowing faintly with the light of the gangs gathering inside. Laughter and raised voices spilled out into the quiet night, their careless noise a sharp contrast to the tension Marcus felt. He wasn't nervous, he was focused, his mind clear, and his body ready. He wasn't here to fight, at least not yet. Tonight was about Reconnaissance, learning the layout of their stronghold, understanding their routines, and confirming Ethan's intel. Marcus slipped from his truck, his movements silent as he made his way toward the building. The shadows were his ally, and he moved through them like a ghost, his years of training guiding every step. Through a broken section of the fence, Marcus crept closer to the warehouse, stopping just outside the reach of the light spilling from a cracked door. He could see them now. 6 men, their faces lit by the flickering glow of the makeshift fire pit in the center of the room. Darrell was easy to spot, his broad shoulders and cocky demeanor marking him as the leader. Wyatt was there too, leaning against the wall with a cigarette dangling from his lips, his sharp eyes scanning the room. The gang was in high spirits, laughing and bragging about their latest exploits. Darrell raised a bottle of beer, his voice carrying over the others. "See, this is what happens when you mess with us. That guy thought he could just walk into our town and act like he belonged here. Not anymore." The others laughed, their voices echoing the empty space. Wyatt smirked but said nothing, his expression more calculating than celebratory. Marcus noted the subtle dynamic between the 2 men. Darrell was the loud leader, the face of their operation, but Wyatt was the one who seemed to hold the real power. As Marcus watched, a flicker of movement caught his eye. A figure stepped into the light. A young man who couldn't have been older than 18. His hands were shoved into his pockets. His shoulders hunched as if he didn't want to be there. Marcus recognized him immediately. It was Ethan. His chest tightened, a mix of anger and concern flooding through him. What was Ethan doing here? Had he been caught, forced to return to the gang? Or had he come on his own, trying to play both sides? Either way, his presence complicated things. Darrell turned to Ethan, a sneer curling his lips. "Took you long enough to show up," he said. "We were starting to think you'd gone soft." Ethan forced a laugh, but it sounded hollow. "Just got caught up," he mumbled. "Didn't mean to miss the fun." Marcus could see the fear in Ethan's posture, the way his eyes darted nervously around the room. He was out of his depth, and it was only a matter of time before Darrell or Wyatt noticed. Marcus clenched his fists, fighting the urge to intervene. This wasn't the time or place. He had to stick to his plan, even if it meant leaving Ethan to fend for himself for now. As the gang continued their raucous celebration, Marcus began to retreat, his steps as careful as when he had arrived. He needed to regroup, to think through his next move. But just as he reached the edge of the fence, a sound shattered the quiet. A sharp whistle that cut through the night. "Hey!" a voice called out. "Who's out there?" Marcus froze, his heart pounding. One of the gang members had stepped outside, his silhouette framed by the light from the warehouse. He held a flashlight, its beam sweeping across the darkness. Marcus dropped to the ground, his body pressed flat against the cold earth. He stayed perfectly still, his breathing slow and controlled. The flashlight's beam passed over him, lingering for a moment before moving on. "Probably just a stray dog," the man muttered, turning back toward the building. "Nothing out here." As the door closed behind him, Marcus exhaled silently, the tension in his muscles slowly releasing. He waited another minute, then carefully made his way back to his truck, every step deliberate and quiet. By the time he reached the safety of the vehicle, His mind was racing. Ethan's presence at the warehouse was a complication he hadn't anticipated, but it also provided an opportunity. If Ethan could gain their trust, he might be able to feed Marcus even more valuable information. But it was a dangerous game, one that could get Ethan killed if he made a wrong move. As Marcus drove away from the warehouse, his grip on the steering wheel tightened. The gang thought they were untouchable, that their power in the town was absolute. But they didn't know what kind of storm was coming. Marcus wasn't just a man defending his home. He was a force they couldn't begin to comprehend. The pieces were falling into place, and the tension was building with every passing moment. Marcus knew the climax was coming, and when it did, the gang would finally understand the true cost of their actions.